Good morning. I'm Heather Westerfield, Chair of the Commission on School Accreditation. This special called meeting of the Commission on School Accreditation is being held today, Thursday, March 21st, 2019, at 10 a.m. in the 4th floor boardroom, Central High School Building, 359 Northwest Street, Jackson, Mississippi. An audio recording is being made of this meeting, and minutes of this meeting will be recorded. This meeting is also being live streamed. Access to the live stream can be found on MDE's webpage. As I call the names of the Commission members, please state the location of your presence for this meeting. Kelly Barfield.
Present, 4th floor boardroom.
Sean Brewer. Kenny Bush. Sarah Foster.
Present, 4th floor boardroom.
Roy Gill. Brian Harvey.
Present, Oxford, Mississippi.
Ann Jones. Michael Lindsay.
Present, 4th floor boardroom.
Dr. Valencia Martin. If you are,
Say Dr. Martin.
yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm in Greenwood, Mississippi.
And
Can
if
you hear me better?
yes, ma'am, can you mute your phone though? We're getting some feedback over here. When you're not talking, that is. Michael Miller. John Mistelis. Anthony Montgomery. Eddie Prather.
Present, 4th floor boardroom, Jackson, Mississippi.
Heather Westerfield, present, 4th floor boardroom. Miss Jones, did you check in, Miss Jones? A quorum of the Commission is present for the purpose of conducting this meeting. This meeting is called to order at 10:08 a.m. Item 2, Commission members, you've received a copy of the agenda. Please note this is a special called meeting, and therefore the only business that can be transacted is that which has been specified in the call of this meeting. At this time, I'll entertain a motion for approval of the agenda. Please identify yourself for the record. Motion by Ms. Barfield.
Second, Sean Brewer.
Second, Sean Brewer. Is there any discussion? All right, I'll do members present, then members on the phone. Members present, all in favor? Any opposed? Members on the phone, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. All right, item 3, we have a report for the recommendations from the Accountability Task Force to revise the business rules of the Mississippi Statewide Accountability System. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Alan Burrow.
I'm going to let Dr. Paula Vanderford give us a little summary statement first.
Well, first, I just want to thank the individuals that have worked on the K-12 subcommittee. You had several meetings. Also, the individuals that served on the Accountability Task Force, because getting to this point today to make these recommendations has not been easy. There's been a lot of individuals that have put a lot of time and effort into this, as well as the two that are sitting beside me, Alan and Deborah, that have worked tirelessly to compile this, and we hope you've had the appropriate backup material to help you make the decisions that are before you today. One of the things that I want to remind you of is that the work of any subcommittee or task force, such as the Accountability Task Force, their job is to make recommendations to the agency. And following those recommendations, the agency has made the determination at this time that it's best to modify those recommendations in a couple of areas. So I just wanted to be clear that what you have before you today is not exactly as it was approved and came out of the Accountability Task Force. But one of the things, in two areas. One is related to a change with the EL component, and Alan will go in detail with that for you throughout the presentation, and the other with the acceleration component and looking at those adjustments. It was really, Mr. Lindsay can speak a little more to this. It was I won't say a controversial issue among the task force, but it was one of the votes that was the most divided to whether or not to have a cap on the acceleration component with the 50 points or to not have a cap. So the accountability task force landed with a vote, I think, of 9-8, something along that lines, to cap that component. And the agency's position is, through our thoughtful discussion, was that we have other components that you can exceed the points that are actually assigned to that component. So why would we necessarily cap the acceleration? So we're moving forward with the recommendation for no cap. However, you have data that represents what it would look like with a cap on the acceleration component as well as not having a cap. You also have a great deal more of data that was provided to you in comparisons with districts and schools as well as high schools with the official 2017-2018 accountability results that did not include an EL component, and then you have the data set that compares it back to the 2017-18 data set that did have an EL component. So what Alan will focus on mostly today in this presentation is the district level data comparing the impact of the changes of the business rules as outlined back to the data set that had the EL component. So we'll focus more on like old, what we refer to as old EL methodology versus the new proposed EL methodology. So we'll go through, and we also have Deborah with us today that if you have any specific questions related to the data that she's prepared, she can address those as well. So, Alan?
Okay. So thank you for that introduction. We'll step through all of these changes, and I'll try to clarify what's been recommended by the task force. There are some additional proposed changes to the business rules as well. So as you know, the work of the accountability system is integral to the vision and mission of the statement in assuring that students are successful in college and career. And our accountability systems are mentioned directly in our mission statement. Accountability addresses all of our strategic plan goals, more specifically goals 1, 2, 4, and 6. And of course, we just keep those strategic goals and plans in mind whenever we are addressing changes to the accountability system. So a summary of the proposed revisions. We have changes proposed to address high schools that have grade configurations that include 12th grade, but also include grade configurations below 9th grade. Changes to acceleration component, the English language progress component, special schools or schools with special populations, and as I mentioned earlier, some general revisions or general housekeeping regarding the business rules. So we'll start with the high school grade configurations. The concern that was communicated to the agency and has been discussed at length over the past couple of years is that we have some grade configurations that are identified as high schools and receive a classification, a performance classification based on them being a high school, although they contain grades below 9th grade, which are elementary and middle school grades. And as you know, there was a subcommittee formed from the commission to address the issue, and the accountability task force worked with that commission to develop a solution or a methodology to address the issue. So the task force recommended a method that adjusts the composite score for these schools in such a way that it considers these different grade classifications or grade configurations. And basically the way that it works is that we separate out grades 3 through 8, and we develop a composite score for those grades, and then separately a composite score for grades 9 through 12. Now, 3 through 8 is on a 700-point scale, so we need to convert that to a scale that's comparable with our 1,000-point scale. So we adjust the. Okay.
Hello, did someone call in?
Did one of the commission members just call in?
No, we had a interruption in service, I believe.
Back up now. Can we tell?
I can hear you. This is Brian Harvey in Oxford. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Harmon. Dr. Martin, are you still with us?
I'm still with you. I can hear you. You just had a beep.
We did too, so.
Is Mr. Montgomery on? Okay, someone said they thought they had heard him. Okay.
Okay, sorry, continue.
Okay, so what we do is we develop a composite score separately for these two grade bands. We convert the 700-point scale to the 1,000-point scale for grades 3 through 8 so that we have a comparable scale across those two composite scores. And then we apply a weighting to the composite scores based on the enrollment percentage in those two different grade bands to come up with a new adjusted composite score. And we use that new adjusted composite score to assign our grade classifications. This methodology resulted in a correction that we felt that was consistent with addressing the issues that were brought up to the agency. This is a summary of the results. We can see here that the way to read this table is on the left-hand side. We had a school that if we split out those two grade bands, each grade band would get an A assignment based on their composite score. In the old methodology, assigning that school on the high school distribution gave them a B overall rating, although the two grade bands would have both been A's. With the adjustment, we get an A for those schools. And you'll see that consistent down the chart there. Same with schools that were both assigned a B, got an overall C. The correction puts them on as a B. You see some mixed results depending on if those separations were an A, B, or AC. But the second column is the count. The third is the old grade assignments. So like in that second blue shaded row there, you'll see that we had one school that was a C and 10 Bs. With the new adjustment, we have 6 Bs and 5 As. So this seems to address the issue and correct the problem.
And Business Rule 1.7 has been added. That's on page 6 of it. That's the business rule that clarifies or the addition to the business rules that addresses what Alan has just gone over.
Oh, so okay. Well, if you look down at the bottom level of the table there, you'll see, for instance, we had on the third row up, we had 3 schools that received an F classification. When they were separated out, they would have been Ds for each grade band, and now those 3 Fs would be Ds. So it affects consistently across the different grade bands. Certainly at the bottom, you're looking at, if we separated out the 2 grade bands, they both received an F rating, they would still receive an F rating in the overall, which would be a desired outcome for those. Does that address your question? Okay. Okay, moving on to acceleration. Yes, sir. Well, it's a direct linking. So there were 3 different methods that the task force looked at in considering this linking. One was a proportional, one was a percentage linking. We ended up with a regression linking. So this is in this case we have three different regressions that we're using to link those grade bands. The B, C, and D grade assignments, where those lie on each scale. So we have a regression for each one. So in order to simplify that process, the task force recommended using a lookup table. So we're calling it a concordance table here. So instead of having these regression formulas, you'll just have a table that says if your score is this on the 700, it links to this on the 1000, and it's a direct linking. So yeah, we could have made it simple, but it wouldn't have been very accurate. So we went with the most accurate method we could. Yeah. That's correct. It will be published and will remain static until such time we change grade cuts. Yeah. Okay, so a brief overview of the acceleration component, just so everybody knows. There's two measures in the acceleration component. One is participation, the other one is performance. This just kind of gives a little overview of how we calculate that, because the business rules that we're addressing here will speak to specific measures of either performance or participation in acceleration. The Accountability Task Force looked at a few issues that we found in acceleration. One was accelerated courses that are designed to be administered over a 2-year period. There were some inconsistencies in how those may have been treated in the accountability model, where, for example, we may have had a course that counted for participation and performance in year 1, but there was no end-of-course assessment in year 1. The end-of-course assessment was issued in year 2 of that accelerated course. So the students were being counted as participating, but they were counting as not proficient in the performance measure. And there was no way they could be counted proficient because there was no end-of-course assessment in that first year. In other instances, there were courses that were given over a 2-year period that were not being counted for participation or performance in year 1, but were then counted in year 2. So that was one of the issues that we're looking at, and I'll address that in specifics. Another one was looking at adding additional weighting for certain courses in acceleration, more specifically dual credit courses versus AP or IB or ACE courses. So I'll discuss those as well. So let's talk about the multi-year accelerated courses. The recommendation was that in the first year of these multi-year courses that the students count or give credit in the participation measure of acceleration, but be excluded from the performance measure in acceleration. And then in the second year of the course, they would count for both participation and performance. This addressed some specific courses in IB, but will also pull in some CTE courses as well that are given over a 2-year period. So it corrects the issue of students being counted in performance that shouldn't have been included in performance, but also pulls in some additional participation measures for students that weren't counting at all in that first year. And then for the weighting, the concern was AP, IB, and ACE courses or in-industry certification courses that have more rigorous performance metrics, more specifically a normed end-of-course assessment related with the course that was more rigorous in comparison to a C grade on a dual credit course, for example. And the Accountability Task Force recommends a doubled weighting for in the performance measure for those courses with a normed end-of-course assessment. So the courses will count the same in participation, but in performance, if a student receives, let's say, a 3, for example, on AP, the student would count twice in the numerator in that course, whereas right now they're just counting once. So this addresses kind of that inconsistency with, or the hesitation to enroll students in a course with a more rigorous requirement for meeting the performance requirement such as AP, and gives a little bit more weighting to those students that are successful in those courses. And then changes regarding dual credit courses. These changes would be in effect next year, not this academic year. But one is to identify a list of dual credit courses that should be counted in Acceleration in order to ensure a minimum level of articulation for these courses. I believe the minimum articulation level is 50% to institutions of higher learning in Mississippi. So this ensures that we have some minimum standards for our dual credit courses. Again, districts can give whatever dual credit courses they want to, but there's going to be a list provided by the Department of Secondary Education of the courses that would be counted in Acceleration. Excuse me. The other change, yes.
So the list is available now. There's already been work that's taken place between the agency and the community colleges, and we could have shared that list with you today. I apologize. We did share it with the Accountability Task Force, and they took some time looking at it to make sure that all the courses that they felt should be on there were on there. That's correct. Is that the way you took that?
We got a copy of that.
One that's on the website now, or is that a different list that is?
No, I think it's a
list of approved
Mhm.
credit courses.
It's not a new list. I think the list has been made available. I don't know if it's on the website or not. I can get that list for you if the commission wants to do it today. I can ask and we can. Yeah, and then a few over that were on the back. Because one of the ones they were looking for was speech and communications or something. It happened to be on the back.
So that's the list we're referring to, is the list. So that list will not change.
That's right.
Now, if there's a course that, and it looked like when I reviewed it, it looked like all of the courses were on there. But if they take an early college or a middle college, and there's a course that's required for that associate's degree, would that be something we could add to that list if that becomes?
I'm sure it's
okay.
a list.
Okay, so it can be worked through as we go through the years. Okay. Okay.
Available for districts to reference to know. Oh yeah, it's a yeah. And then the CTE courses are already in the approved course codes for the secondary schools.
Okay, and the other issue that we wanted to address was some inconsistencies with our measures of performance for dual credit courses. So right now we're pulling grade information, pass-fail information on these courses from school districts through MSIS. We want to pull grade assignments or performance measures for these courses directly from the secondary institution issuing the credit for the course so that we have a consistent measure of performance. And this won't bring in any weighting that districts may apply for grades for dual credit courses at the district level. This would not affect the district's ability to weight course grades in dual credit, but would give us some standardized measures of performance and accountability. Okay, so talk about English language progress towards proficiency. So just as a brief overview, our EL, yes sir. Okay. for accountability purposes.
And we still have, we talked about this a little bit with Superintendent's Advisory Council yesterday, but we still have to define what that process looks like. I mean, that's not the only reason that this is delayed to the next school year, but we have to have a systematic way for getting these grades. But because districts, local districts have the authority to establish their own grading policies, and the MDE doesn't have authority related to your grading policies, there's some inconsistencies. Some districts wait, some don't, some wait more than others wait. And so, you know, for purposes in the accountability system, the non-weighted grade as assigned by the community college will be what's used.
You've got to use the community college's grading scale in those classes.
But some districts, when they receive those grades, they have a local district policy that weights those grades and gives them a higher weight. And so rather than, I mean, if the community college issues a C and it goes through grading policy, which weights that C, and it becomes a B, then the B is for local district purposes on your transcripts and your calculations of GPAs, et cetera, but the C will be what's used for accountability purposes.
Well, right, and that's one of the reasons why we're making this effective in the next year. We need to work through that process, but also, you know, give everybody due notice and everybody understands what we're working towards.
And you know, higher that counts,
right,
you know, in
right,
the performance piece. So it, I guess it's really only impacts those Ds that are weighted to a C to count. So the Ds would not count in the C.
Before you go on to the next slide, I need to remind the commission members to speak into the mics. I'm getting messages that the people that are watching it online can't hear the commission members asking the questions.
All of the business rules that are associated with the slides that Alan just covered begin with section number 9 on page 11, 12, and I guess it's just 11 and 12, and a little bit on the top of page 13. Try to where you see it converted to a business rule.
English language
15.
progress. Okay, so as you may know, but just in case we need a refresher, in the EL progress measure, each student has an annual progress goal to meet based on a overall goal of exiting, well, reaching proficiency, I should say, in the ELPT English Language Proficiency Exam by year 5. Then there's a score assigned to each student based on the amount of progress that they make, ranging from 0 to 1, 0 being no progress made or a regression in progress, 1 being they met the annual progress goal and they're on track to exit in 5 years. And then there's an additional rule that reduces the points that are awarded for students that don't exit by year 5. So students that exit year 6, 7, and so on. So some things that the Accountability Task Force looked at and in detail were adjusting the method of aggregation. So this is one thing I didn't mention in the prior slide, but the way in which we attribute the points earned in the EL component to the overall composite score for that school or district. So I'll discuss that in detail. Removing the point reduction for students that reach proficiency after 5th year. So this was something that was recommended by the Technical Advisory Committee, that we don't have this reduction applied in year 6, 7, and so on. So the task force recommended removing that reduction, so that's pretty straightforward. And then the other thing that the task force looked at was awarding, well, the way in which we scale the composite score for schools and districts. So right now we have a rule that says that if a school has at least 90% of its EL population meeting progress, that the school will receive 100% of the available points in the EL component. So for a high school, it's 50 points. If they get at least 90% of their EL population meeting progress, they get 50 points for the EL component. So we were looking at adjusting that, but we're not recommending that we adjust that scaling at this point because there are other issues with the EL component that we want to address and make considerations for moving forward. And we feel like it would be premature to make such a major change as adjusting that scaling for the EL component at this point. Plus, you'll see that the changes that are proposed do have some pretty significant impact on the EL component in the positive nature already. But some other things that we want to look at that are going to take more time is that 5-year goal that we have established for all EL students. We recognize and we can see that in the data that there is not this nonlinear, I mean, it is a nonlinear progress that we see in the data. In other words, students that are in lower grade levels tend to make more progress on a year-to-year basis than students in higher grade levels. Also, students that enter and score a higher level on the ELPT don't necessarily need 5 years to exit. They may only need 3 years, depending on what level they enter in. So we want to look at adjusting those annual goals for EL students based on the grade in which they start the EL program and the entry level for those students. But we've got to work. We're working with our testing vendor to get multi-year data on this to come up with some progression for where we want at least 3 years of data. So we're looking at some national aggregate data for this exam that we use, and we're working with the vendor on that. But Mississippi is also involved in a multi-state study of the English language progress measures and accountability with CCSSO. So we want to give time to work through that. We're going to look at the component in its entirety from the assessment all the way through how the score impacts overall accountability measures. So there's going to be some more things that we're going to look at in the EL component in the coming year. So just some things to consider. This is a step in some changes that we know that we can make, kind of some low-hanging fruit, if you will, in the EL component. So that's what we're recommending at this time. So let's talk about the aggregation method. The other change that I mentioned, which was removing that reduction after year 5, is pretty straightforward. But let me talk about what we did with how we applied the points in the prior year. The way in which the points were applied was to calculate the EL progress component score. Let's talk about first school. It applies the same way for districts. So whatever the score was, let's say an elementary school had an EL progress score of 30, and their maximum available points was 35. So that's a 5-point difference. We simply subtracted from the composite score for that school 5 points. So that's how it was done this past year. There were a few reasons why we did it that way, but the main thing that we heard from the field was the EL component can only, I hate to use the word hurt or harm you, but the EL component can only reduce your composite score, and that was the case with that aggregation method. But this new proposal or method is to simply apply an adjustment, like you see in the tables that we have out there with all the boxes. You have proficiency, for example, reduced from 100 points to 95 points. Each component is reduced by 5%, and then those points are assigned to the EL progress component, and we calculate the EL progress score, and we add it in with all the other components to come up with a composite score. So we're just reducing all the other components by 5%, calculating an EL score, adding all of them up, and that gives you your composite score, which is consistent with how we apply scores for components as it is currently. So is that clear as mud? Does everybody understand kind of what the change is here? So one other way to look at this is it's applying the weighting as though it is written in our ESSA plan. That is a 5% reduction to other components. We're assigning those points to the EL, and the EL progress is added in just like any other component. So we looked at some data on that. This is a scatter plot just to show how points shifted by changing that aggregation method. And basically what we see, the scatter plot on the left is 700-point schools, and the scatter plot on the right, 1,000-point schools. And what these basically tell us is that there is a shift upward in the score, the composite score for those schools, by changing the methodology. But the distribution you see is fairly similar. So with that in mind, the impact was there wasn't a major impact, and so we also felt that the new aggregation method addressed that concern that the EL component could only reduce composite score. That's right. So that's right. So yeah, a school must have at least 10 EL students that meet FAE in the current year and have a prior year score. So we'll look at some impact data here. Everybody has a printout that is 7 pages. So this data that you have considers several different baselines, if you will. We have, I'll just go over that briefly and then we'll talk about what I have in my PowerPoint. So on page 2 you've got district data. So this starts with last year's 2018 official grade, which did not include the EL component. So that's on page 2, and then I'll talk about the specifics of each table. On page 3 is district level data starting with the 2018 grade with the EL component. So that's not our official grade for 2018, but it is what grades would have been had we had an EL component included last year. And then on page 4 is for schools, all schools. Same logic, 2018 official grade, which did not contain an EL component. Page 5 is all schools, 2018, starting with 2018 grade, what it would have been had there been an EL component included. And then page 6 and 7 are just high schools. And we separated out just high schools because we're looking at acceleration in this impact data, which only affects high schools and districts.
Yeah, we're
Backup materials, the packet that we sent you.
Tab 3 page.
Yeah, and it's also behind tab 3, a hard copy that's not the. I mean, it's the same as what you're saying. It's just not printed in color in your binder.
So what I wanted to do is what I'm considering is the change that the impact of the change to the EL component from, and I want to compare apples to apples. So I want to compare the change this year, or well, our proposed method. We're looking at last year's data in general, but the proposed change versus what it would have been before with an EL component. So in my presentation, you'll just see district information comparing back to the 2018 grade had there been an EL component included. I think that's the best apples to apples comparison here to look at when we're making the change to the component. But we've provided to you additional data in case you wanted to see those other pieces. So what I have in this first slide, Table A, proposed changes to EL component. So this is just if we're applying the new methodology to the EL, that is the new aggregation method, and we're removing that reduction in points after year 5. And the comparison is what grades were in 2018 with an EL component included. So that you see in that second column the total count. Those are grade or performance classification assignments, A, B, C, D, and F, and the count for 2018 had there been an EL component included. Then in our next columns there we have the points change, so we can see the number of districts that increased in points, so that's the up column, the counts for no change, and then down. So we didn't have any districts that had any reduction in points with this new methodology applied to the EL component. And then the next section is grade change, so a performance classification change. So for example, we had 5 districts that moved up a grade from B to A, and we didn't have looking in that same row, the 37 that did not change and 0 that went down. So we did not have any that decreased a performance classification. We had some that did increase a performance classification. And then on that far right hand side is the max points that any one district in that category changed. So in the A performance classification, those districts that were in that, one of them increased by 19 points. None of them decreased. That's the way to read those tables. So we'll look at also districts with adding in our changes to acceleration. So that is doubling the weight for courses with a end of course normed assessment, and our changes proposed to the EL component and how that impacts the district score. So this one considers with a cap or a limit on the number of points that a school or district can earn in the acceleration component. And you'll see here that we do have some negative impact on points, not performance classification, but we do have a few that drop in points, and that's because we already have some high schools and districts that have more than 50 points in performance and acceleration. So if we apply this cap, we see that negative impact here. It's not a significant impact, but there is a negative impact. And then the next one is changes to EL, again district level, changes to EL, changes to acceleration, but not applying any cap to acceleration. So here we don't see any negative impact. The changes to the EL and acceleration component both show a positive movement on points and for some districts grades. And then in the next slide we have just kind of a summary table here. This looks at performance classification assignments and counts for each of those categories. So in 2018 we had 18 districts receive an A. That's the official grade. If there had been an EL component included, it would have only been 14 districts that would have received an A. So with our changes to EL, we would have 19 districts with an A. With the changes to EL and acceleration with a cap, there would have been 20, and with no cap, there would have been 22. So you can see how that distribution changes with these business rule changes.
So that would be, the commission, of course, has that option. The Accountability Task Force did recommend that the acceleration component have a cap, but the MDE's recommendation is to modify the recommendation of the task force and to not impose a cap. But we wanted you to see the data with or without the cap, and you know, and just noting that our recommendation from the agency's position is different than that of the task force. And then, of course, we did not show you impact data with the EL component, but provided the rationale because there's a couple of more areas that were recommended by our technical advisory committee and the national experts when we looked at our EL component after the business rules were developed and implemented after the first year of data that was unofficial last year. And we just felt like moving forward with that third recommendation to award maximum progress at 70% proficient, that it was just at this time, it's not recommended until we have some more data and consider those other areas in conjunction with that change. And then two, significant changes may require, to the EL component, may require us to have to go back and revise our ESSA plan, and we could not implement those business rules effective this year because we did not submit those changes. So everything that you have before you today, with the exception of the slide that had the 2 dual credit recommendations, would be effective for 18-19 accountability at the end of the APA process. So it takes us about 60 days to get through the APA process. So if your recommendations move forward to the board on March 28th, we begin the APA process, come back in May. So it'll be final in June, ahead of the assessment data being returned to the district and the agency.
I understand your point.
Yes.
I was just going to say, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
I've got two questions. One is the acceleration cap. Obviously, that was divisive in the fact that it's a 9-8 vote. What was the rationale of the members who voted for a cap?
I mean, honestly, Mr. Lindsay might could help more so with that, or Alan. I mean, it was just.
Cap, so
Mr. Lindsay said he wasn't one that voted for the cap. I honestly don't know what the rationale was for those that voted to have the cap.
And you guys can correct me, but just recalling some of the conversations, I guess it came about when we started talking about double weight for having a 3 or higher in AP or a 4 or higher in IB, and I think maybe some of the concern was some of the schools and advanced students would be making the strong schools stronger, or the higher performing schools higher performing. But I don't, after you look at the data, I don't think that's the case. I think most of your schools that are exceeding the cap, it is not because of the AP, and it will not be because of the AP weight. It's more the dual credit than it is the AP. So I'm not sure, and that's just me speaking. I can't speak for the other members.
I think that's a good summation. That was one of the concerns, and it is true. When we look at the data, really the ones that are getting 100% or more on performance it's mostly or all dual credit courses. And the other side was, I guess, on a technical point of view, when you consider changes to accountability components, you don't want to change the weighting to the overall model that a component may have. But when we look at acceleration, it's really hard for a school or district to get anywhere near 100% participation in acceleration. So although you may have over 100% in performance, that's kind of just going to spill over and kind of more fill the bucket on the participation side. So you're really still not going to get over 50 points in acceleration once you add those two together. Most schools are, in most cases, I mean, it would be unusual to have 100% participation in acceleration.
Well, and I know this is not something that we're acting on today, but making a C in a dual enrollment class is not the same thing as making a 3 or better on an AP, and I'm not sure how IB scores are scored, but I know those two aren't equitable.
I agree.
You also have the
I don't think it's close.
Right.
So these changes are meant to address that issue, the changes that we're discussing.
Yeah. I guess the second thing that I assuming that none of these changes, because nothing is recommended, or at least currently, none of these none of the changes that we're making would cause us to change the cut score percentages or anything like that.
Correct. There's been no conversation regarding changing cut points at any level. I mean, at the 700 point or the 1,000 point or the district.
But it is possible biology could cause that to happen.
Of the methodology that we're using for biology this year.
Trying to avert
That's for that, to avoid that.
And I guess the point I was going to make when we started was the points you made are valid. The recommendations are here. I mean, as a commission, I would have rather just heard the debate that the task force had on the third item and then still heard the recommendation that you don't recommend to move forward with it. I mean, there's experts, including TAC and you and that group spent that time working on it, and then the decision not to present it, where we could at least see it and go with that recommendation, but that would be my preference.
I just have a question on, and making sure I understand, on the double weights, will it follow the same methodology of, say, like the 1.1, it'd be 2? How, in other words, if you have multiple AP courses,
not include the 0.1% of increase. So one AP course double weighted would count. One AP course would count as 2 points. 2 AP courses would count as 4 points. It does the 0.1% of weighting only still applies to the dual credit courses. Does that make sense?
So we're not adding those on top of each other.
that's just because the way just checking making sure that I understand.
No, I would disagree that if the pursuit is the most academic rigorous avenue possible, and to keep that in mind, I mean, performance on the AP really hard. I would agree with that being represented in how that plays out in the accountability model.
Okay, I will proceed.
And those numbers that we just looked at, like the EL acceleration, no cap or cap, that includes the double weight for AP 3 or higher, 4 or higher, and IB. Okay.
Yes.
That is on the table today to add that to the business rule.
That's correct. All right, so a few other things
That are not reflected in the impact data.
Yeah, so these things are not included in the impact data, but would have minimal impact anyway. So these are some other changes that this one did go through the accountability task force addressing schools with special populations. So task force recommends, and the MDE recommends, adding to Business Rule 21, which provides for some exclusions for special schools in the business rules, to add child development centers as authorized in Mississippi Code 372391. So we have some very specific schools or programs that are included in that statute that would be excluded from performance classifications, and those scores for those students would be attributed back to the school and district of residency. So some things we've got to do with those two schools is to ensure that we do have data for those students on their district and school of residency entered in MSIS, but then we'll get those assigned back to the school and district of residency. So the state law, there was some discussions and interpretation of state law that all schools must receive a performance classification. As you know, there was some proposed legislation this past year I don't think it went through the process, or I know it didn't go through the process to exclude some schools from the performance classification assignment. So we felt that this was a way to address the concern through the business rules to not assign a performance classification for these specific schools with special populations. It is consistent with practices in other states. What other states do to get around, well, I shouldn't say get around, but to address programs or schools that have specific or special populations, are to address those as programs, which is a more appropriate classification than putting them in the same classification with regular schools that have regular populations. These are programs that have a specific subgroup or of students.
So on page 17 with of the second set of your backup with business rule with the section 21, so these centers will be folded in to be treated the same as alternative programs. So the students will still be included in the accountability system. Their scores will just go back to their home schools, like alternative programs and career and technical programs. So the students
Earlier, but will those schools still have a school code and be counted?
We haven't worked out the details of exactly, how that will work and be coded in the system. And then it will be certainly limited to the centers that are authorized in state statute. So they will still be required to assess all students, and then all students that are eligible scores will count in the accountability system. It will just be at those resident schools.
There are some other programs that are addressed in state and federal law, such as schools within correctional facilities, the Mississippi School for Math and Science, Mississippi School for the Arts, have their students sent back to their home school or residency school and district residency. Right, and that does comply with federal regulation that all students are included in accountability measures, but also helps to address the other concern with performance classifications.
And although that rule would be effective for the 17-18 accountability, it would not be until this current year, 18-19, that the scores would be attributed back to the home schools.
Those scores aren't weighted in any way, so technically the schools that they're being redirected to are going to be affected negatively by the school.
Negatively, there will include the scores of all students.
I mean, if they were all left schools before, I can't.
In other words, if those students are all scoring a 0 because they're not able to cope with them, and that 0 is going to be a negative impact on the school, the school within that.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking. If these child development centers didn't exist, these students would be in those schools.
Aren't able to go to.
Well, but in some counties that's the way it is. There isn't a special program for these students, so they are in their school of residency. And then I believe in some areas we have some students that are sent to specific schools that have are better equipped to serve the students. But in those cases, like that can occur within a district, but the student is attributed back to their home school in that district.
Now, how do, like she mentioned, the School of the Arts, they take classes at Brookhaven High School. Grades go back to the other districts, their core class.
Arts is those students enroll as 11th graders, and so when you look at the 1,000 point for schools with a grade 12, All of the assessments have been taken with the exception of ACT and maybe
U.S. history, maybe.
And graduation rate. So the maximum points that those schools could earn is 300 of 1,000 points. But those schools are still, I mean, we still are having ongoing conversation. We haven't resolved that concern about them not being assigned a grade.
So if they were assigned a grade, like the School of Math and Science wouldn't have a grade, because all of the grades would be dispersed out to the individual schools?
Right, they currently don't receive a grade.
Be like a pro, they'd be considered a pro.
That's correct.
That's currently how it's done.
Okay, so our last bit of information is just addressing the general updates to the language in the business rules to comply with new language, new provisions within ESSA, for example, how we identify schools for school improvement, removing AYP language from the business rules, from No Child Left Behind, to address some technical issues that have arisen. An example is, you may have noticed in the rules, a student that skips the 10th grade. So a student may go from the 9th to 11th grade, and we include students for high school measures of performance in the 10th grade. So we want to make sure we're capturing those students that skip the 10th grade. So there's a couple of issues in there like that. And then just making some clarifications based on questions that the department has received regarding business rules. So does anybody have any additional questions regarding things they see in the business rule changes, proposed changes, or any other thing that we've discussed we haven't addressed?
Process of then applying to schools and districts the letter grade classification.
So there was some concern about how this change would affect the distribution when we establish cuts. Currently, these schools are all included as a high school, and so whenever we establish cuts for performance classifications, we're comparing all high schools together, separately all elementary and middle schools, and then all districts. And then so that's why we have 3 different sets of cuts. So the concern was pulling out these schools from that high school distribution and how that would affect the distribution. And the task force felt fairly strongly that we should not affect that method, and that we should be consistent moving forward with how we establish cuts, so that we still treat these schools as they are currently treated and how they're currently included in performance classification cuts moving forward. So essentially, we added 1.7.1 and 1.7.2 just to clarify that the purpose of this adjustment is in the assignment of the performance classification only. So we're not adjusting any other use of that composite score or what they would normally get, other than to address the concerns regarding the performance classification. That's correct.
I guess I would say overall, I think there's some really smart moves in here, some things that took a while to get to that make a lot of sense. When we sat here for hours at times, not really knowing what direction was some of that subcommittee. I guess one question I would have under the EL, so we talked about 1, talked about 2, and talked about 3 was not recommended, and there's no impact data here. Mike, maybe you could address this or not. I mean, did the task force see impact data? What was that discussion like for as to a little background on that?
Talking about the scaling. the 70.
70%, taking it from 90 to 70%.
Really what we see, and when we look at that impact data, is that whole distribution, as you expect, the whole distribution kind of collapses upward. So if we lower that that target for schools from 90 to 70%, you just kind of squish that distribution up.
Had a large impact on the distribution.
Yeah, and then we start to worry about what the federal government calls meaningful differentiation. And that is just to say that you should have a span in your performance measures from low to high. So we see that, and that's a concern that we could have gone down the road discussing and looking at further, but we have to kind of see this bigger picture hanging out there, and that is the other adjustments that we want to consider and how that might impact that EL component. And if we bring everybody up and say, okay, now everybody's really doing great in EL progress, and then we put in some more changes, and then it collapses it even further, and then we have to come back and redistribute that distribution, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people because they've been moved back down. So we felt like it was a little premature to make that change until we address the rest of the concerns.
Like there was a significant impact in the lower grades, a larger impact there, and I think that just through the conversations that we had, I think everybody was thinking that it would be great to have that, I think, which was number 3 in our packet that we looked at, of the changes of being able to assign the years of growth and the growth per kid, depending on the grade level, to be a little bit more individual and specific to the students than just saying 5 years. And I think one of the concerns that came up about the 70% was that if you did that, are we just going to ignore that, which may be a better way of holding our students accountable for that growth level. So there was a little bit of concern about the 70%. So I definitely understand, the direction MD is going with it.
And I guess what I'm gathering right there is the difference between students that are performing better in that component versus worse. There wouldn't be a difference a significant difference in how that's shown in accountability, because everybody being inclusive sort of in spot, which makes sense to me.
Yeah, and it seems pretty obvious to everybody, especially if you look at the data about we need to make some adjustments to that target year. So I feel confident that we'll get there. We just want to make sure we have some sound data to work from. But you hear it from the field. Elementary schools that teach lower grades, the EL students in the lower grades say, "Oh, my students are making a proficiency in 3 years. Well, shouldn't I get some extra credit?" I don't. Maybe the target goal really shouldn't be 5 years for those students. Maybe it should be 3 years. And then the high schools say, well, gosh, it takes longer than 5 years to get a student that starts in, say, the 7th, 8th grade to proficiency. Maybe it should be 6 years for those students in higher grades. So I think that those are some things that are going to kind of address more concerns on the granular level at individual schools and the discrepancy between elementary and high schools, and probably address more concerns once we get there.
A timeline again, question on that. So this recommendation will go to the state board, and then it will fit the timeline. So the things that will affect this year's accountability would be the recommendation as it gets approved by the state board and goes through the process to EL this year, and then also to the acceleration would be this year. But then the grades coming from IHL would not be this year, but next year. Just so I'm trying to.
Right. So if you look at your business rules behind tab 3, section 9, the acceleration component, it would be page 12, 9.2.2. 9.2.1 are the only 2 changes to the business rules that would not be effective for the 18-19 school year. It's that one slide on dual credit under the acceleration component that would be delayed until the 19-20 school year. And then, you know, with 9.2.1, I mean, we don't know that there's any districts out there that have students enrolled in a dual credit course that would not be on that list of articulated courses, but we didn't want to notify the district in the second semester that you were going to be limited to that list. That was not fair to the district, nor the students. And then, of course, the non-weighted grades. I mean, it was going to, we would have to develop a process to have that in place for 19-20 for it to be non-weighted. And again, the district did not have advance notice of that.
Following up on that, what he was asking, I guess I put clarity timeline. So any of the recommendation coming out this year that's going to impact school district rating in the fall. Is there anything here that's going to affect that when the district can say, well, I didn't know this throughout the year to make an adjustment? Other than
based on the impact data, you know, that we have and that we've seen, there should not be any concerns related to that, because the benefits of or any benefit of the change
Affect them positively.
For all performance classifications.
Yeah, we would have that concern if we were negatively impacting someone, but our recommendations don't have a negative impact on anyone.
.2, 1.3, 1.4. Is that correct that two of those are for the 2016-17 year, but one?
That's correct, because for 17-18, we reestablished the cut points for the high schools only. And the previous year for 16-17, all the cuts were established. And so we inserted the percentiles for Business Rule 1.1.1 because that's currently the approved policy. And each year that we've established those cut points, we've had to go back and pull out the board item and the date that those percentile ranks were approved. So we thought to go ahead and have it in one place, and the business rule would be beneficial when people are looking for those numbers on the percentile. So doesn't mean we're changing anything. That was just an addition for clarification. So that's the overview of the 1% cap. That's a federal.
Yeah. So this is to apply to comply with federal requirements that less than 1% of students are alternately assessed in the state. Mississippi has a higher assessment rate for alternate students currently, but we have a waiver, and we're working to address that. But this applies in the accountability calculation to say that a district can't have any more than 1% of their population that's scoring proficient on the alternate assessment. Now, in the state aggregate, we are nowhere near that. We're at like 0.5% of proficient students scoring proficient on the alternate assessment. But we had this rule in here, but we didn't have a clarification of what would be applied if there was an adjustment. So we were. That's right.
If they did score proficient?
As being considered not proficient, obviously.
Yes. It is. So, for example, if you had a district where more than 1% of their proficient students
with disability.
I'm sorry.
Taking the alternate.
Yeah. So
okay.
If more than 1% of their total student population was scoring proficient using the alternate assessment, that the amount over 1% would not be counted as proficient. Now, that's right. They'd be counted as non-proficient. Yeah.
And we're striking the language be adjusted because we're currently under a waiver from USDE for that testing that 1%. over that 1% population.
So would those be reduced from the denominator also?
No. No, the denominator would not change. That's going to be your total student count. And this comes from federal regulation again. The intent is to prevent schools from giving the alternate assessment in order to get a higher proficiency rating. Yeah. We don't know. We haven't ran the data at the district level, but yeah, it's kind of one of those things that we know at the state aggregate it's only 0.5%. So,
but
it would be unusual.
But the way that language was currently written and being adjusted gave the appearance that we were having to adjust, and we're not having to adjust. So we clarified the language to be consistent with federal regulations.
Page 7. That's 95%. They'll be dropped to performance classification.
Right. It would.
You only want it a little bit.
So this is part of ESSA requirement that if you have less than 95% participation, that it affect or goes into your performance classification as well. So our under our state regulation, it's a drop of a letter grade. Then this is adding in order to comply with ESSA regulation, and Deborah does those calculations so she can tell you more how that.
So, if I'm saying this correctly, if you had 94.5 students participating, the 0.5% of students would count as non-proficient. So they would be included in the denominator and count as non-proficient, so that your total population testing and recorded as either proficient or non-proficient is 95% of the total population.
No. So basically,
for performance only, does not proficiency. Yes, it does not carry over to growth.
Right. Yeah. So
it says 94.5% would not be rounded up. Would 94.8% be rounded up?
No. We've had schools with 94.9% participation that get dropped.
That doesn't really read that way. It just says 94.5 will not be rounded up. So maybe.
Or we could just say, okay, we can clarify that to indicate that there's no rounding.
Yeah, no rounding.
no rounding.
Okay. Yeah. So students that are on an IEP can be given an ungraded grade assignment. So it's 56 or 58 grade code, and MSIS. So those students aren't considered enrolled in a particular grade, but we have to treat them, and this comes from federal regulation, when we're calculating the 4-year adjusted cohort, we have to assign them to a peer age so that we can figure out when to add them to the cohort. Because for graded students, it's whenever they get to the 9th grade. That's the first time they get to the 9th grade, that's when they're entered in the cohort. But we don't have that for non-graded students, so we assign them based on whether or not they're age 14 as of September 1st of that year. That's when they get added to the 4-year adjusted cohort. Now, a bit of information that's important to know, and it's a change for us, is that we now have a state-defined alternate diploma, and students that are SCD that are on track to receive an alternate diploma can go beyond that 4th year and still be counted as a graduate if they receive that state-defined alternate diploma after the 4th year, up until they can no longer receive services based on their age. So that's going to allow more of these students to count as a graduate than in the past. In the past, they would have been counted as still enrolled if they went to 5th grade, which does not help the graduation rate. But now they would be counted as a graduate.
And those alternate diploma requirements have been added to Appendix A of the accountability standards as well.
I think reference I saw was on page 20.
The ACT. Well, so that was as of last year. So that was with. Well, yeah, I'll get. Under ESSA language, well, in our ESSA state plan, we submitted a component, the college and career readiness component. The college career readiness component only consists of the ACT. So when we submitted it, our business rules at the time said that SCD students would be excluded from the component, and the federal government said you cannot exclude a particular class or subgroup of students from any measure of performance. So this is our college and career readiness component. There's no other alternate measure of performance for SCD students. It's the ACT, period. So those students must be included in that measure of performance. So we're clarifying some language here regarding that. We deleted 25.9 last year, which addressed specifically SCD students in that component, but we did not catch the except students identified in MSIS as SCD in 25.10, so we're doing that now. But those students were included in the component last year for grades last year. So what's new this year may be that more people know that that's the issue, because it was that way last year. We don't really have a choice. We can't exclude those students. What I guess the choice would be, and what we need to consider, is there an alternate measure of performance for SCD students in that college career readiness component going forward? Well, if they don't participate in the ACT, they're not included in the performance measure. So that's in the business.
They don't have to take the ACT.
A lot of questions coming in from districts that ACT students are, SCD students are required to take, and that's not a correct statement. We can't exclude them. They would only be required to take it if their IEP indicates, if the IEP committee indicates that they should take it. So we put 25.9 back in with some clarification. And at the time that we came to the commission to modify the business rules to comply with ESSA, we also had excluded SCD students from the acceleration component. So when we modified those business rules last year, we also modified Section 9 under acceleration not to exclude that population. That's right. Unless that's correct.
Yeah, and I mean, they will be included in the participation.
Counting 95%.
Right. So depending on your,
No, all
Either way.
students, all students have to be included.
So that's the only remaining hang-up. If they don't take the ACT assessment, they're not included in the performance measure. So they're not, these students aren't automatically being counted as non-proficient on the CCR component. But you may remember for high schools, we calculate participation based on senior snapshot. So all students that are enrolled for that minimum enrollment period to meet senior snapshot requirements are included in participation measures, and each student has multiple measures of participation. You've got math, science, English, and U.S. history, and ACT. So 5 measures of performance for each student. So there's a lot of counts for participation. For SCD students, they are not counted in U.S. history. They are excluded from U.S. history. That's not a federal requirement, so we can't exclude them from that. But they still have the 4 that they're going to be counted for in participation. So essentially, if they don't participate in the ACT, they're a quarter of a count off on participation measure. It kind of does, because there's multiple measures of performance for that student, it does diminish the weighting for missing just the ACT. And the only concern that a high school or district should have regarding accountability implications is if you drop below 95% participation. So there is that 5% leeway built in. And then hopefully maybe at some point we can identify some type of alternative measure for CCR for SCD students. I don't know what that would be. I really don't have any ideas at this point, but
questions or discussion? All right, if not, we will move on to item 4. Okay, I've been informed we are going to, the next item is our action item to approve. So we're going to vote for all of the changes except Business Rule 21, which is the Child Development Centers, because Mr. Gill is going to excuse himself from that vote just because that does affect his district, and we will vote for that one separately. So. Okay. All right, so commission members, at this time, I will entertain a motion for approval to submit a request to the State Board of Education to begin the Administrative Procedures Act AP process to revise the business rules, with the exception of Rule 21, of the Mississippi Statewide Accountability System.
Mike Lindsay, so moved.
Motion by Mr. Lindsay.
Second, Sarah Foster.
Second by Ms. Foster. Is there any discussion? Okay, members that are present, all in favor?
Aye.
Oppose? Members on the phone, all in favor? Any oppose? Okay, the motion carries. Okay, and at this time, I'll entertain a motion for approval to submit a request to the State Board of Education to begin the Administrative Procedures Process Act process to revise the Business Rule 21 to the Mississippi Statewide Accountability System. Motion by Mr. Brewer.
Prather, second.
By Mr. Prather. Is there any discussion? Members that are present, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oppose? Members on the phone, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Did somebody join us? Mr. Montgomery, did you join us?
Yes, ma'am, I did about, 35 minutes ago.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and then, oh, would you state your location, please?
1 Hancock Plaza, Gulfport, Mississippi.
Thank you. Okay, and just again, any on the phone oppose? Okay, the motion carries. Very good. All right. So item 5, a motion for adjournment. And just before we adjourn, I do want to express my appreciation for all of your hard work on this. Mr. Lindsay serving on the task force, Ms. Barfield, and Mr. Brewer serving on the K-12 subcommittee. I know a lot of hard work went into this today, so I do appreciate that very much. Thank you for your time. So at this time, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Okay. Motion by Ms. Barfield. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Gill. Any discussion? All in members present, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Members on the phone, all in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries. We stand adjourned at 11:37. Thank you very much, everybody. Y'all have a great rest of the day.
Bye-bye.